Okay, Apple just released this, the new M2 iPad Pro, and looking at it, you really wouldn't know that anything's new. But maybe you could say that about the past few generations of iPad Pros. I mean, they've kind of kept the same design since 2018, and that's not a bad thing. The 2018 iPad Pro brought in a really good design, and even today in 2022, as I'm sitting here using this new iPad Pro, which looks the same as the same iPad that I've been using since 2018, I gotta say, like, hardware-wise, like, this is still a really impressive device on the market. And I thought the same thing when Apple released the last version of this iPad Pro with the M1 chip. In a way, it was kind of astounding to me that Apple managed to put an M1 chip into the iPad Pro, and basically, we were getting the same level of performance that we now had on our Macs, that we now have on this very thin and light iPad. But maybe I shouldn't have been too surprised, right? Like, the Mac basically got iPad chips inside of them. Like, the M1 was going to be some version of like an A14X before it was the M1. And basically, Apple, did a nice bit of marketing where these iPad chips became Mac chips. But either way, it's impressive. The M1 power was super impressive. The fact that they got it in a very thin, relatively thin tablet with no fan inside of it, and the performance they were able to get out of the iPad Pro with an M1 chip was just really good, right? But there was like a big bit of backlash against that iPad. Not because of the performance. Like, everyone, I think, agreed that performance on that machine was really good. But it was really the software, because you finally had all of this performance inside of an iPad. You had configurations that went up to 16 gigabytes of memory if you got the higher storage tiered iPads. And people were kind of wondering, like, how can I actually take advantage of all of this iPad processing power? And it kind of seemed like you really couldn't. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there are people that can take advantage of the iPad's M1 chip, utilize the full power out of it. I really think the iPad for artists or maybe even photographers, some of the apps that are available for it are actually really good. There are some pro level apps in those departments, but it's still lacking behind in a lot of other areas. For me, as a video editor, I haven't found an app that I can really flow with on the iPad Pro quite yet. I know developers in particular, there really isn't a lot for the iPad Pro, and then 3D modeling, all that other stuff. So in terms of software for professional level stuff on an iPad Pro, it still has a long way to go, which is why I feel like there's been even more backlash against this version of the iPad Pro, which people have kind of just been bashing as kind of not having a reason to exist. But I'm here to kind of defend it in a way, because I think that Apple should have updated this iPad Pro, and I'm not necessarily too mad about the updates they made to it, because, well, I can just imagine the alternative, but let me talk about what's new here. So now, instead of an M1 chip in this iPad Pro, we get a faster M2 chip. Now, more performance is great. Like, you run a Geekbench benchmark on this iPad Pro, you look at the single core and multi-core performance, and again, it's kind of like that initial wow, when I first used the M1 iPad Pro, I went, wow, this thing is really, really fast. Apple is squeezing a lot of power out of these Apple silicon chips in such thin and light tablet bodies. Like, if you look at like Surface hardware or a comparable tablet on the Android side, like, you are not getting this much performance in a body that is this thin, doesn't have a fan in it. There's not a lot of sacrifices this thing has to make to get that hardware power. And that is really, really amazing. But then the problem remains, like, what do I use this M2 chip for? And listen, I've lived with the M1 iPad Pro for a while. I know my use cases with it, and I didn't find anything for me that could take full advantage of that M1 chip. So, even going into this review, or this isn't even really a review, but even talking about this device and using it for the past few days, there really isn't anything that I found where the M2 chip is making like a drastic difference in performance. The M1 iPad Pro is fast. This new M2 iPad Pro is fast as well. But yes, this has an M2 chip. It's faster. It benchmarks faster. Whatever, right? All good, right? Like, who doesn't want a faster device? But there's also some other improvements here as well, but not many, right? So I would say probably one of the biggest improvements for customers might actually be the faster Wi-Fi 6E speed. I believe this is the first Apple device with Wi-Fi 6E, and I have a Wi-Fi 6E router. I ran a speed test doing like a download on the Wi-Fi 6E connection, and it was really fast, right? Like I have like a 940 megabits per second internet connection at home with Wi-Fi 6E on the download. I got like the full bandwidth of that download connection on my iPad Pro. If I did the same test on my M1 iPad Pro, I would get around like 300 to 400 megabits per second on that same Wi-Fi connection. So Wi-Fi 6E in here, I believe, again, the first Apple device to have this. It's a nice improvement. I am glad to have it in this iPad Pro. Another nice improvement for it was this new Apple Pencil hover feature, which actually turned out to be cooler than I thought, because when they first demoed it, they basically showed it off as a way to kind of preview where your Apple Pencil was about to go in other applications, particularly for like drawing applications, right? Like Wacom tablets have done this for like a pretty long time, where you bring your stylus and like hover it across the screen and you can basically see where you're about to write down on. I think that might actually be a feature that some artists really want, might actually help with the accuracy of drawing on the iPad Pro. I'm not an artist, so I guess it's kind of hard for me to review that. But I do know a couple artists in my life who use Wacom tablets. That is a feature that they have. But it also turns out to be a cool way to navigate the user interface. Now, I think I got like a little bit of blowback on this on Twitter for saying that it's a way to navigate the user interface. And I'm not saying it's like a game changer or anything, but it is a nice little visual touch that before you go to like tap an icon, you're basically getting the same cursor UI that Apple would use when you hover the trackpad along these icons. So they kind of just pop up a little bit. They kind of get highlighted. Like if you're scrolling through a list, the list highlights before you're about to tap. Again, it is not really going to change the way that you navigate the user interface. I think like the biggest thing I found like is in Safari, like when you scroll down and then the Safari URL tab like collapses on itself. When you bring it back up to there, everything pops up into place, like the URL bar, the tabs, and you can kind of select it without tapping twice. It's probably like the biggest maybe UI change I've seen with the Apple Pencil hover feature. But again, like you could have just tapped it and then tapped it again. It's not a like revolution in navigating the user interface. It's just kind of like a cool visual gimmick, at least for now. But hey, I kind of like the cool visual gimmick on it because it just makes the iPadOS feel a bit more lively when you're using Apple Pencil. But that's it, right? The M2 chip, the faster Wi-Fi 6E speeds, this new Apple Pencil hover feature, those are the only improvements really that are brought over to this iPad Pro that are exclusive to it. Obviously, the big feature this version for iPadOS 16.1 is the new Stage Manager feature. So this is a way to actually get overlapping windows on the iPad Pro. Probably the most significant redesign to multitasking on the iPad Pro ever, or on iPad in general, I should say. It does work on the iPad Air as well for the M1 version. And listen, Stage Manager, I used it during the beta period. I'm using it now that it's officially out, and I gotta say, it doesn't do much for me. Like, yes, you can have like 4 apps open at once on your iPad. Maybe there are some use cases where I'm like, okay, this kind of works okay. But for the most part, when I'm using apps on the iPad, I would just rather use the default iPad view. I would rather just use the multitasking view as it is, because the way that Stage Manager is currently implemented just doesn't feel that intuitive. And even things like resizing the windows, it just feels like you're limited in control. Moving these windows around, like you can kind of almost move them anywhere, but then you like move something else and it snaps to another place. So the way that Stage Manager is implemented on the iPad Pro, it's a nice shot at having like this multitasking stuff, but I still feel like it needs a lot of work. I feel like Apple is making a lot of weird decisions here with the way that Stage Manager works to just make it feel different than macOS and how they have done overlapping windows in macOS. And I just kind of wish at this point that you have a system where you know how these windows work and how overlapping windows work. You already have these expectations built in from years and years and years of people using macOS. So when macOS users come over and use this iPad Pro with Stage Manager, they are expecting a similar experience. So if you're going to make individual windows on the iPad OS, why not just take it from macOS at that point? Give us the system we expect at this point. If you want to limit it to 4 apps, fine. If you want to do that weird thing where you have these apps over on the side view, fine. But when I go to resize a window, when I go to move a window, I expect it to work like macOS. It should work like macOS. But yeah, I don't need to go into it. Hardware on this continues to be great. It's the software still. And I think there was a period in my life where I was a pretty heavy iPad user. I go back to the 2017 iPad Pro, and I use that thing a lot. And basically, I would use a combination of my Mac desktop, and when I was portable, I would use my iPad. But then a lot shifted when those first Apple Silicon Macs came out. A lot of the things that I would use my iPad for, because the iPad was just so much better at the Mac, at waking up fast, having really good battery life, just being super responsive, loading apps really quickly. Like, that's why I use my iPad a lot over my Mac. And once Apple brought, the M1 chip, as we kind of started this video, over to the Mac, well, I just started using my Mac more than my iPad for everything, because all the strengths that this iPad had with good battery life, thermal efficiency, performance, all those strengths were just basically brought over to the Mac. And all the weaknesses here remained with the software. We should not be mad by the spec bump update that Apple made. Sometimes an update is just a spec bump, like the alternative of the true updates to this iPad Pro still being a year out and Apple just leaving the M1 iPad Pro on the table for another year to purchase without any spec bump upgrades, I think would be more infuriating. Like, if we went from M1 to M3, that's bad, right? Like, you should offer the updates that are ready at the time, give someone the best possible iPad Pro if they're walking into the store to buy one, because, believe it or not, some people need a new iPad Pro and they can't wait another year for the next one, right? Like, again, I said it in the beginning, this might be an important tool for certain users. If you're a digital artist, if you're doing photography, like, this does have its place. But again, I just come back to me as someone who was expecting more significant software advancements since the M1 iPad Pro. We still don't have that here with the M2 iPad Pro, at least not yet. So if you already like the philosophy of the iPad Pro, you're going to like this M2 iPad Pro. Like, it's still the iPad, and it's the best version of the iPad Pro. But if you're like me and you're kind of still waiting for video editing software or a more enhanced multitasking system, or just the way that certain things operate, like maybe like file management, then you're not going to be happy with this iPad Pro. No amount of hardware improvements was going to make you happy. You wanted a big software update. And that doesn't just apply to the M2 iPad Pro. That applies to all the old iPads that have been out since then. So listen, if you need a new iPad Pro and you really want one, this is the best version available. If you're on an M1, obviously don't upgrade. And if you're a Mac user and you were waiting for this like new revolution to happen, it didn't happen. So if you like this video, give me a like. Let me know what you think about the new M2 iPad Pro in the comments below. And hey, if you liked it, yeah, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you in the next one. I'll see you in the next video, if it wasn't too ranty.